this week from the autobiography of a yogi. So this first chant we will do is called Listen, Listen, Listen to My Heart Song. I will never forget thee, I will never forsake thee. Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram Jai Ram, 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 Jai Jai Ram, Sri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Sri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Shri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Sri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Sri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Sri gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them at thy feet. Dipping them in devotion, I will lay them. Is the beauty of my mind on the blue lotus fruit of my delight? Is the beauty of my mind on the blue lotus fruit of my divine mother? Divine mother, my divine mother,
Mother, my divine. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, divine Mother. Is the beauty of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my divine Mother. Is the beauty of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, my divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, my rose is the beauty of my mind, on the blue lotus of my divine Mother. Is the beauty of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, my divine. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, rose is the beauty of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my divine. Rose is the beauty of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my divine. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, my divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, my divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother. Divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother, divine Mother, my divine Mother, divine Mother. Let's meditate now for about 10 minutes. Prepare for meditation by tensing the body. Throw the breath out and relax. Again, tense and relax. One more time. And now a few rounds of deep measured breathing. Inhale. Hold the breath. Exhale. Again, inhale. Hold. Exhale. Once more, inhale. Hold.
Exhale. Take a deep breath. Let the breath out. And now when the breath comes in of its own accord, you can begin practicing Hong Sa, or simply watch the breath. Eyes gazing gently upwards. Body completely relaxed, shoulders back, chest out. You can offer up the natural love of your heart upwards to the point between the eyebrows, offering yourself completely at the feet of the divine, into that light, into that bliss. We'll meditate for almost 10 minutes. again, welcome everyone to our monks webinar. Our monastery is here in Kandala in India. And every other Friday evening, we share from the Paramahansa Yogananda Daily Wisdom app, which is a Google Play Store app, an Android app that's available on the Google Play Store. Just search for Autobiography of a Yogi Daily Wisdom. Each day, there is a piece of wisdom, a sentence, a few sentences from Autobiography of a Yogi. People don't think of that book as being full of just pure wisdom, but in fact, there is at least 365 days worth of wisdom in there. And so we'll share a sentence or two here from the readings from last week, next week, and talk a little bit about it again. And again, my name is Nayaswami Devarshi. This is Gaurav here. The November 10th reading. It's a quote from Swami Sri Yukteswarji. It's in the great chapter, The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. Sri Yukteswarji says, the earth-liberated astral being meets a multitude of relatives, fathers, mothers, wives, husbands, and friends, acquired during different incarnations on earth, as they appear from time to time in various parts of the astral realms. He is therefore at a loss to understand whom to love especially. He learns in this way to give a divine and equal love to all, as children and individualized expressions of God. This is a very beautiful passage. I have found it very, very helpful as a way of just understanding the highest way to relate to others. Because when we relate to people in the role that they play in our life, it's limiting and binding. And we are all individualized spirit, children of God. And when we relate to someone as my wife, my husband, my child, it limits them. Yes, we have a role to play in this life, and we must play that role well. If we have a child, we must treat it and raise it and support its upbringing as a child. But even in such situations, try to see the soul beyond that relationship, because that soul of that child is every bit equal to yourself in every really important way. Yet again, this is the strangeness of this world, is that we also have to play this role. But we've played many roles in many lifetimes. And this role that we play in this lifetime, try not to limit yourself. Play it well, but don't over-identify with it. There was a mother and a child at Ananda village, or ashram in California. And the child was getting a little bit irritated with the mother for some of the discipline, I think, that it was giving. And the child just looked at the mother and said, in our last lifetime, I was the mother and you were the child. And that was probably part of the irritation the child was feeling, was that it was used to being in charge in the previous lifetime to this particular soul. And it was a little bit frustrating that it was no longer in charge. And so that child had to learn to play that role better, but it was also tuning into a deep truth, that it was not a child, unless you think of it as a child of the infinite, as a child of God. And so when we relate to others in that way, we relate to the highest in them, and we don't limit them. And we also don't have ownership over them as my child, my husband, my wife, my relative, my this or that. Because in fact, to their mother, they have a different relationship. Their mother sees them as a child. We see the person as a spouse. And yet really they are all of those things. They are none of those things. And so when we can relate as a soul to a soul, then we start to really tune in and have a much deeper kind of love for others. It's not limited and bound by the compulsion of the particular relationship that we have. Paramahansa Yoganandaji talked about different relationships. He said that the highest relationship of all is divine friend. He said other relationships are binding because they have some compulsion and tie and limitation. The limitation of a spouse and expectation, parents, children, relatives. But divine friendship is unconditional, true divine friendship of just giving divine love to another soul, uplifting them unconditionally no matter what. And this is the relationship that we have with all souls that we form positive relationships with on the astral plane. So try to work with starting now, because again, when you get to the astral plane, as Sri Teshwarji says, it can be very confusing. You see your wife, but you realize that next to her is maybe her husband from her previous lifetime. And there's your wife from the previous lifetime. And there's your child who actually is an adult, and it was your father in the past lifetime. And the head spins when it sees all this confusing things, because we bind ourselves and limit ourselves to these relationships. So try to go beyond that. For those who have lost a loved one, this chapter, The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar, is really one of the most beautiful chapters in that book. And it helps you to feel a great deal of freedom from that loss and that grief, because you realize that the soul is immortal and the soul has not really gone anywhere. When my own wife, as she was preparing to leave the body, she was giving advice from Swami Kriyanandaji. And he just said, try to see when you leave the body, he said, try to see like, it's just like going into the next room. It's not a big deal. You've done it a million times. And she found that very, very helpful and liberating for losing that fear of death that many people have. I found in my own reading of this chapter and how it helped me is that by tuning into her soul rather than to the relationship that we had, that connection was much stronger. Because I found that when I prayed to her, communed with her in meditation after she left the body, and I saw her as my wife in that relationship, I could feel her almost on some level pulling away, because she did not want to be limited anymore by that old relationship, because she saw the much broader and bigger picture. But when I related to her in meditation, in prayer, just as a divine friend, as a child of the infinite, we helped each other find God. We were Guru Bhais. We served our Guru together for many, many, many years. And when I related in that way, then I felt her coming much closer. And that relationship, that soul relationship, was much more pure and clear and without any limitation and without any bondage. So try even now, to all those around you, try to tune in more on a soul level. Again, even to your child. When I was at Ananda village last year, I was with a very good friend of mine. His name is Kalidas. And he has a child about 5 years old. His name is Japa. And we were just sitting in front of our market on a nice, beautiful day, enjoying some conversation. And his son came up. And Kalidas, just with a big smile, he pointed to his son and he said, "That's my guru." I just laughed because I didn't know what he was going to say next, but I knew it was going to be some deep wisdom. He said, "That's my guru because he teaches me how to love unconditionally. He teaches me how to forgive. He teaches me how to be more centered and more kind. And he teaches me in so many ways." And that was beautiful because he wasn't relating to that soul as just this little child who was ignorant and learning and this and that. He saw him on a soul level as an equal. Yet he also is a good parent and supports the child where he is at in his physical and emotional growth. But by doing that, he's able to give much more to that child and have a much deeper relationship. So don't limit yourself by the relationship that you have with a particular person. Try to tune into the soul behind the relationship and behind your own mental and emotional limitations of what you think that person is in this lifetime.
Thank you, Devarshiji. This next excerpt is from the chapter on the sleepless saint, where Ram Gopal Majumdar is talking to Paramahansa Yogananda when he visits him in his village. And the saying says, "Do not fix your spiritual ideal on a small mountain, but hitch it to the star of unqualified divine attainment. If you work hard, you will get there." And for those of us who've read this chapter, we know Ram Gopal Majumdar was a deep, deep soul. And he, in fact, meditated many years and for many hours a day, up to 20 hours a day. And, even with all that effort, he's advising Yogananda ji that aim higher, don't settle for less. And this is very good advice for us as devotees on the path, because, as time goes by, for one reason or the other, we start out on the spiritual path enthusiastically, and sometimes, we walk down, life throws things at us. And if we find ourselves in that, phase, dealing with, let's say, a certain amount of, just slowness in our path, then it's good to once in a while step back and see, what can I do better? And so we should always aim high, is what Ram Gopal Majumdar is saying, which means to always keep our spiritual ideals high, not to let them fall, even if, let's say, right now you do not have the energy or the enthusiasm, perhaps because of a dry period. Don't let your ideals sink. That the heights of spiritual attainment, don't bring them down. Also, Paramahansa Yogananda ji, he said to disciples during his lifetime, he said, consider it your duty to become Jivan Muktas in this lifetime, which is, Jivan Mukta is one who is freed while living. So one would think, you read about these great saints in the autobiography, those, sleepless saint, a saint with two bodies, and this saint and that saint. And one part of you comes away thinking, I can never be like that. I mean, God knows how many lifetimes these saints spent in meditation and seclusion, and, they found God. But then on the other hand, you hear those words of Yogananda ji, in which he spoke to the disciples, and in fact to each one of us, holding out that same promise of saying that you too can become free in this lifetime, and in fact exhorting us that it was our duty to do so. So it's something to think about. When I was new on the spiritual path, I somehow got into this, confusion or delusion, I should say, that I somehow thought, that if I'm wanting divine freedom or liberation, or enlightenment, some part of me thought it was selfish to do that. And it actually prevented me from making the right kind of spiritual effort, because part of that was that, oh, enlightenment anyways is going to come from God, and God decides when liberation comes. So, why trouble yourself too much, But Yogananda, and then of course, as time passed, I studied the lives of saints, great saints from all religions, and saw just the heroic efforts they put into their spiritual search, and just literally they went after God, which is what Ram Gopal Majumdar also was doing here when Yogananda met him. So also to say that as he says, a great deal of effort, hard work is necessary on the disciples' part. I think that is an old way of thinking, which left all the hard work to God, and which said, let me do my little bit of, rituals or puja, and just please the gods, and then God will take care of me. I think this path, especially that we are on, is just a total contrast to that, where Yogananda says, we put in our great effort, and, we do the best we can, and then our efforts, automatically draw the response from God. I also want to share just on this note that what is this hard work that Ram Gopal was mentioning? He says, if you work hard, you will get there. And it's good to have a little perspective on that, because it isn't as if that hard work is, going out into the world and doing, hard things, so to speak, or to, put a lot of physical effort or strain into doing things in the world. In fact, that work that he's talking about, which is the hardest actually, is the inner work. And the spiritual path, enlightenment, liberation, all are dependent upon the degree of effort we put inside, on ourselves, within ourselves, the work we do upon ourselves. And I say that because, even as devotees, even as seekers on the spiritual path, we can be caught up so much sometimes in the outward things of our life, the circumstances, our busy work and life and schedules, and our social commitments and all of those things, that sometimes we can forget what is the work after all, what is the hard work that I need to do. And so always to remember that it is primarily an inner work of let's say, transcending the ego, of purifying our hearts, making them, offering more and more ourselves at the feet of the divine. And that is hard work. If you think that's easy work, then try to catch yourself next time when you're with people, you're at work. Pause a little and think, in this interaction that just happened with this person, how did it go? What was uppermost in my mind during the 8 hours that I was at work during today? What was uppermost in my mind? The thought, was it one of service? Was I thinking of this as an offering? Or did I just rush through the day trying to finish my work, trying to rush back home so I could have some rest? And, if you find yourselves thinking in that way, you'll see that that is the hard work, to work on yourselves, to be centered, to offer the ego in every circumstance, whether it's when dealing with another person, thinking of them in the highest way, or whether it's thinking of your work. And so just to step back sometimes and have that perspective. And if you find a gloomy picture, state of affairs right now, then don't be disheartened. Again, remember that keep your spiritual ideals high, take a break, introspect, and put yourself with double effort into your spiritual search.
The November 21st reading begins Swami Sri Keshwarji. Ever new joy is God. He is inexhaustible. As you continue your meditations during the years, He will beguile you with an infinite ingenuity. This was partly in response to Yoganandaji, the young Yoganandaji, who had the experience of cosmic consciousness, of divine bliss. And he asked his guru, when will I find God? And Sri Keshwarji, in his wisdom, laughed at this young disciple who was playing the role of a disciple for all of us to learn from, and just chided him and said, you think that God is some old man in some antiseptic corner of the universe? No, God is ever new joy, ever new bliss. Swami Kriyananda once said in response to a question, he said that God is feeling, and that feeling is Satchidanandam, ever new bliss. Now, we can't limit God to just being one thing. God is bliss, God is love, God is infinitely vast, God is infinitely personal. This is why, again, partly why Sri Keshwarji said that God will beguile you with an infinite ingenuity. I was reading a great saint was being questioned and challenged because this saint worshipped God in form, in some form as Divine Mother or such. I don't recall what the detail was. And there was a yogi of more jnana yogi of wisdom saying, how can you limit God to that form? God is infinite and God is vast and you cannot limit God. And this saint, who was actually more wise than this yogi, looked at the yogi and he said, how can you limit God by just only being infinitely vast? God is also infinitely personal and infinitely intimate for each one of us. And this is the next reading that I'll read, which is also Swami Sri Keshwarji, who again was a great saint of wisdom, who said, he is also near and dear. After the mind has been cleared by Kriya Yoga of sensory obstacles, meditation furnishes a twofold proof of God. Ever new joy is evidence of his existence, convincing to our very atoms. Also in meditation, one finds his instant guidance, his adequate response to every difficulty. So he is saying that God is also infinitely personal, intimate, coming to us, not in a limited form, but just in whatever way the devotee worships. In this chapter that I mentioned earlier, the resurrection of Sri Yukteswar, there's a beautiful line in there where he says that when devotees go to the astral plane, that God appears in whatever form and in whatever way they worship God when they were on earth. And he said, just with a very wry humor, that humans challenge God's creativity with all the different forms that they worship, and God does come down to each one in a very personal way. It comes as God Father, God the Mother, God as this form of Divine Mother, or this great saint or great master. And so don't limit the possibility of the divine to come to us in very personal ways, to offer guidance in meditation, to protect us, to watch over us. And so just learn this childlike trust that the divine, whether we are seeing the divine or not, whether we are hearing that divine voice or not, trust that God, in its infinite capacity to help each one of us individually and personally, is there. Just like when Krishna was dancing with the gopis, every single gopi had their own Krishna dancing with them, and there was hundreds or thousands of forms of Krishna. They were each relating personally and individually to the Lord. And this is part of the infinite vastness of God, that the Lord can come to us personally and individually in whatever way we call, whatever way we pray. And this is the divine relationship and the infinite ingenuity of God that Sri Yukteswarji talks about. And so when we pray, when we meditate, yes, pray and worship to God in form, but also tune to God as divine feeling. Because ultimately, when we merge back into the infinite and back into God with the experience of samadhi, cosmic consciousness, it is samadhi bliss. It is this divine joy from which we were made and which we were really is our final destination in life, is to merge back into this divine bliss. As Yoganandaji writes in that poem, Samadhi, the last phrases, he says, "From joy I came, for joy I live, in sacred joy I melt again." And then he says, "A tiny bubble of laughter, I am become the sea of mirth itself." And so meditate on those words in that chapter. And not just the words, but the feeling and the vibration, the feeling of bliss, the feeling of joy, the feeling of infinite expansion. And as you meditate in this way, you'll find that even divine bliss is a very, almost a personal way of God coming to us through the feeling of our heart, through the feeling of our consciousness. So don't limit God in any way. Be open to any possibility when we meditate, when we pray.
So our last reading is again from the same chapter, the resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. And it says, when man's desire to live is severely shaken by disease or other causes, death arrives. The heavy overcoat of the flesh is temporarily shed. The soul, however, remains encased in the astral and causal bodies. The adhesive force by which all three bodies are held together is desire. The power of unfulfilled desires is the root of all man's slavery. That's an interesting passage where, Sri Yukteswarji one is saying that sometimes people have the belief, and, I think in India we have that especially so, that, if during your last moments on earth, when you're about to pass away, if you can remember God, say the name of God, that you'll be free, or you go to a holy city like Kashi, Banaras, and you leave your body there, no matter how you've lived your life, you will find eternal freedom. And I think first, obviously, he's saying that is not the case, because there is more at play there. We just don't have physical bodies. Even after losing our physical bodies, we have astral bodies and causal bodies. And they too have their desires or seeds of desires that need to be worked out before the soul can find eventual eternal freedom. But then he's talking about desire. And that is a powerful statement, that he says unfulfilled desires are the root of all man's slavery. And in a later passage, he says that the very fact that we have bodies, that the soul has a body, says that you have unfulfilled desires. That if you don't have any desires, you would cease to even have a physical or an astral or a causal body. So interesting to think about that for each one of us individually, and even to introspect and maybe even write down on a piece of paper, maybe after this webinar, that, what are the desires playing in my mind all the time at this point in time in my life? And just to kind of putting them on a piece of paper can also put some distance between you and them, because otherwise they're always in your mind. But when you see them on a piece of paper, step back from them and use a little wisdom and say, these are things that are running my life and propelling me towards them. But if you use your wisdom a little bit, you will see that a desire is nothing but the hope of fulfillment in the future. And what happens when you fulfill that desire? Another comes up and another comes up. Even something so trivial as that 3 times during the day you have desires for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And you have breakfast, you've had food, and you feel satisfied. But come 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, that desire reawakens and again propels you to have another meal. And come 6, 7, 8 o'clock and again. So just to say that the power of desire. But if we want to get rid of desire, because in this world, desire, you can say in one sense, is the ruling force, and it keeps us bound from one thing to the other. Because in our minds, we are always looking, the soul is always looking for that something that will fulfill it. So in one sense, it's not, the principle behind desire is not bad, that we are looking, and we don't find fulfillment, and that is why the wise soul is still looking. Of course, the things of this world do not satisfy us, and that is where the folly lies. But if we want to find eternal happiness, then interestingly, it is desire itself that will take us there. And that is, as Yogananda used to say, is to cultivate the all-consuming, all-powerful, one-pointed desire for God, for the divine, for the beloved, because that too, desires arise in the heart, the yogis say, and the desire for God too, the love for God, for freedom, also resides in the heart. And the heart, anything that you love deeply, it has a power to it. So don't feel too bad if you have too many desires, if you have too many things that your mind is reaching out to. Of course, use some wisdom. You can use it in small ways by thinking, perhaps if I don't eat something for a particular day, say to yourself sometimes, I won't die. If I don't eat that thing for 1 day or for 2 days or for 3 days. But if you probe a little deeper, you'll find that perhaps by not doing that, in a day or 2 days or 3 days, that desire might die because it'll be starved of not being able to, being fed again and again. But most important of all, cultivate that desire for God. And if you can channel your heart's love into everything you do, then even the desires that you have in your life, you can spiritualize them. So for example, if you have a, strong desire or attachment to food, then offer it to God, and you can even visualize God is sitting at the table with you and say, Lord, I offer you this food. I hope you like it. And in that sense, at least the direction of your heart's energy is moving upward rather than, just all consuming, thinking about yourself. And so in little ways, in big ways, try to apply that principle. Be a little detached from your desires. Know that fulfillment does not lie there. Maybe temporary pleasure, maybe in the joy of an ice cream, and that is okay. But always, like Ram Gopal Mujumdar again said, fix your gaze up high. Don't let it settle for less. And aim high, pray to God and the divine gurus to help you in your divine search. Their blessings will be with us all.